Hello, and welcome to our explainer on market structures. Look, if you've got an exam coming up, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to break down all the essential concepts you need to know to really nail those multiple choice questions.
So here's the plan. We'll kick things off with some basic definitions. Then we'll walk through the 4 different market types. After that, we'll test what you've learned with a few practice questions and then wrap everything up with a really focused, high-yield review to make sure it all sticks.
Okay, first things first, we've got to build a solid foundation, right? So we're going to start with 2 really fundamental definitions that you absolutely have to know before we can even begin to talk about the different market types. So what exactly is a market? Well, it's not always a physical place. It's really any situation or system, like a physical store, an online shop, even a phone call that just lets buyers and sellers connect and make a deal. And that leads us right into the main event for today, market structure. Just think of it as a way to classify industries. We're basically looking at how many companies are competing and what that competition looks like. Seriously, getting this concept down is the key to everything else we're going to cover. All right, let's jump into our first market structure. We're going to start at one extreme end of the spectrum, with the most competitive market you can possibly imagine. This one's called perfect competition. So for a market to be considered perfectly competitive, it has to check all of these boxes. You've got tons of buyers and sellers, and all the firms are selling an identical product. I mean, a completely identical product. A great example is local vegetable farmers. A carrot from one farmer is pretty much the same as a carrot from another, right? And because of that, there's no need to advertise. And this is a big one. There are no barriers. It's super easy for new firms to start selling and for existing ones to leave if they want. Okay, this leads to a super important concept for your exam. Firms in perfect competition are what we call price takers. Just think about it. If you're one farmer in a giant market and you try to sell your carrots for double the price, what's going to happen? Nobody's going to buy from you, right? Because each seller is so small compared to the whole market, they have zero power to influence the price. They just have to accept or take the price that the market sets. Now, this graph might look a little intimidating, but it shows a really simple rule for how these firms maximize their profit. All you need to know is that the firm will keep producing its product right up to the point where the market price, which we call P, is exactly equal to its marginal cost, or MC. And marginal cost is just the cost of making one more item. So the big takeaway, the formula you need to burn into your brain, is P equals MC. All right, now let's do a complete 180. We're going to swing to the total opposite end of the competition spectrum. We just talked about a market with tons of sellers. Now let's talk about a market with only one, and that's called a monopoly. So a monopoly has a few key features. First, there's just one seller. Second, they sell a unique product that has no close substitutes. But honestly, the most important characteristic here are the huge barriers to entry. These are things that make it pretty much impossible for any other company to jump in and compete. A classic example is your local electricity company. You can't just start your own power company, right? You only have one choice. So why do monopolies even exist? Well, they can form for a few different reasons. You might have a natural monopoly, where it's just way more efficient for one company to do the job, like with public utilities. Then there's a geographic monopoly. Think of the only gas station in a tiny remote town. A technological monopoly is when a company has a patent on an invention. And finally, you can have a government monopoly, which is, well, it's owned and run by the government. Okay, let's look at how a monopoly makes its profit. Now, the first step is the same for any company. They produce at the quantity where their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost. That's the MR equals MC rule. But, and this is the big difference, because they're the only seller, they can then look at the demand curve and charge a way higher price. This is a super important distinction for your exam. For monopoly, the price is greater than the marginal cost. Okay, so we've looked at the 2 extremes, right? Perfect competition on one end and monopoly on the other. But let's be real, most markets you see in the real world are somewhere in the middle. So now let's explore those middle grounds, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. First up, monopolistic competition. Now, this one sounds a bit like perfect competition, and in one way it is. There are still many firms. But here is the single most important difference you need to remember for your exam. The products are differentiated, not identical. So, what is product differentiation? It's really all about making your product seem special or unique. This can be done through branding, a different design, maybe better quality. The perfect example is something like Coke versus Pepsi. I mean, they're both colas, right? But these companies spend a fortune on advertising, which, by the way, economists call non-price competition, just to convince us that their drink is the different, better one. Next up, we have oligopoly. This is what you get when a market is dominated by just a handful of huge companies. Think about airlines or your cell phone provider. The key word you have to know for oligopoly is interdependence. It's kind of like a high-stakes chess match. Since there are only a few big players, every single move one company makes, like if they decide to lower their prices, is going to have a massive impact on the others. And you can bet they're going to react. And this brings us to a major MCQ alert. This is a classic trick question on exams, so listen up. You have to remember, firms in perfect competition are price takers. They have zero control over price. But firms in an oligopoly are price makers. Because they're so big, they absolutely can influence and help make the market price. Don't mix those two up.
Okay, so you've got the theory down. Now it's time to see how you do under pressure. Let's try a couple of exam-style questions to see exactly how these concepts might pop up on your test.
Okay, question 1. Have a read, take a moment, and think back to the most basic definition of a monopoly. What's the one thing that defines it? All right, if you chose C, you are correct. A monopoly, by its very definition, is a market with one seller of one particular product. Let's see why the others are wrong. Option A, multiple sellers, that's describing a competitive market, not a monopoly. And B is tricky, but a monopoly focuses on a single, unique product, not a bunch of different ones. Okay, next question. This one is testing if you know your barriers to entry, especially the kind that leads to a technological monopoly. What do we call the exclusive right to an invention? And the correct answer here is D, a patent. Now, this is a classic MCQ trap because copyright looks tempting, but you have to remember the difference. A copyright protects artistic things like a book or a song. A patent is what protects an actual invention, and it's what gives the inventor a temporary monopoly. All right, we're in the home stretch. For this final section, we're going to pull everything together and do a quick-fire review of the most important high-yield facts, the stuff you absolutely want to have memorized heading into your exam. This chart right here, this is your best friend for studying. It lays everything out side by side. When you're reviewing, pay super close attention to the rows for nature of product, barriers to entry, interdependence, and that relationship between price and marginal cost. I promise you, this is where the exam questions are going to come from. Look, if you're cramming for the exam and only have time to memorize a few things, make it these points. First, every single firm, no matter the market, maximizes profit where MR equals MC. Got it? But only in perfect competition does price also equal MC. Know the difference between price takers and price makers. Remember that product differentiation is the key to monopolistic competition. And know that interdependence defines an oligopoly. And finally, a monopoly means one seller and high barriers to entry. These are your guaranteed exam winners. And to wrap up, I'll just leave you with a final question to think about, to connect all this theory to the real world. Which one of these market structures do you think is actually the best for us, the consumers? Would you rather have the super low prices you get in perfect competition? Or do you prefer the variety and innovation that comes from a market with differentiated products? It's a really interesting debate. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.